Hey there, everyone. We're going deep today, a deep dive into something, pretty heavy, honestly. School shootings and gun violence here in America.
Yeah.
It's a lot to unpack, and honestly, the goal here is just cut through the noise, right? Try and make sense of this whole thing. Give you, the listener, a clearer picture of what we're dealing with here. And to help us do that, we're going to be pulling from this podcast called Breaking Point. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar.
Yeah. Some really eye-opening stuff in there. And look, let's just be upfront. The statistics are straight up alarming. We're talking like the Gun Violence Archive, they've already clocked over 600 mass shootings this year alone in the U.S.
Yeah.
And that's just mass shootings, right?
Yeah.
If we zoom in on schools specifically, the K-12 school shooting database, it shows an average of 30 shootings every year since 2013. 30 shootings a year. Impacting kids, like, think about it. Kids as young as kindergarten?
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff, right? It's a reality, though, and we got to confront it. So the big question is why? Why are these numbers so tragically high? Where do we even begin?
Well, one piece of the puzzle, and it's a big one, is just how easy it is to get a gun in the U.S. I mean, we have more guns than people.
Seriously.
Yeah, like about 120 guns for every 100 people. That's a lot of firepower. Now, of course, this doesn't mean every gun owner is a threat.
Right. Yeah, first line.
But it does mean that someone who wants to do harm has a much easier time getting their hands on a weapon here compared to a lot of other places.
Yeah, it's like statistically, the odds are just different here.
Right.
Breaking Point podcast, they really hammered that point home.
Yeah.
But it's not just the number of guns out there, right? It's the laws, too.
Absolutely. The U.S., I mean, we have some of the most relaxed gun laws in the developed world.
Really?
Yeah, for real. In a lot of states, you can just buy a gun, no background check, no waiting period, nothing. Just like that. And then you've got this thing called the gun show loophole, which basically means private sales can just slip under the radar.
Hold on, wait. I've heard of that loophole thing, but I never really understood it. Can you, break it down for me? What makes it a loophole exactly?
Sure. Imagine gun regulations, right? Picture it as a net trying to catch people who shouldn't have guns. Well, this gun show loophole, it's like a hole in that net. See, private sellers at these gun shows, they don't have to do background checks. They don't get to keep records or follow the same rules as like a regular gun store.
So someone could fail a background check at a store, but then just go to a gun show and get a gun, no problem.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a point of contention for sure. There are arguments on both sides. It all ties into the bigger conversation about gun culture in America, you know. We've got this deep-rooted history, this tradition of gun ownership tied to the Second Amendment, individual liberty.
Yeah, the Breaking Point people, they touched on that too. But they also asked this question, and it really got me thinking. When does that right to own a gun, when does it start to step on the toes of public safety?
That's the balancing act, isn't it? It's a tricky one.
It really is. And I think to really get this, we got to bring in another huge factor. And that's the mental health crisis, the one we've got going on in America. Mm-hmm. Now, look, this isn't about saying everyone who struggles with mental health is dangerous. Absolutely not.
Right.
But the podcast did make this connection between, a history of mental health issues and some of these school shooters.
Yeah, it's there. It's a link we can't ignore.
It's a sensitive topic for sure, but it feels like we got to talk about it, right? It's not about pointing fingers. It's about trying to understand what might be contributing to these tragedies.
Absolutely. And, this whole thing shines a light on another problem, a big one, and that's our mental health care system. Or, the lack of a decent one. It's underfunded. It's overburdened. Imagine a kid who's struggling, right? Maybe showing some signs, but they just can't get the help they need.
Yeah.
Long wait lists, high costs, not enough therapists. It's a mess.
It's heartbreaking to think about those kids just slipping through the cracks. We're talking about potentially stopping tragedies before they even happen if we just had the right support systems in place. So I guess the big takeaway here for you, what stands out?
What gets me is how it's not just one thing, It's all of these things, all these different issues, they're all tangled up together. Easy access to guns, the laws, the mental health crisis, and then our culture, how we view guns in America. It's a lot.
It's like this huge knot, and we're trying to figure out how to untie it. But I think before we get too bogged down, maybe we can look at some other countries, see if they've got any ideas. The Breaking Point podcast, they had some interesting examples. They talked about Australia, how they did some pretty drastic things after that Port Arthur massacre back in '96.
Right.
They banned semi-automatic weapons, even did a mandatory buyback program. Big changes.
Yeah, and the results, they haven't had a mass shooting since. Now, look, that doesn't mean their system is perfect or that we could just copy and paste it here, but it shows that stricter gun control, well, it can really make a difference.
It's a powerful example for sure. And it makes you wonder why it's so hard to even have a conversation about gun control here in the U.S.
Yeah.
The podcast, they pointed to political gridlock as a huge roadblock. They talked about the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and how much influence they have.
Oh, yeah. The NRA, they're a big player in all this, spending millions, lobbying politicians, shaping public opinion. They're fighting hard against any kind of stricter gun laws. Their whole thing is protecting those Second Amendment rights.
Which is, it's a valid point. But it's frustrating, right? Like, even when you've got tons of people demanding change, things just get stuck in this political back and forth. It can feel pretty hopeless, but there are people out there fighting for change, right? Like every town for gun safety, Moms Demand Action, those groups.
Absolutely. Those groups, they're doing incredible work, raising awareness, pushing for stronger laws, supporting victims. They're out there fighting at every level. Local, state, national, they're making a difference.
And we can't forget the Parkland kids, the survivors of that shooting. They took their grief and turned it into action, organizing marches, speaking out, demanding that lawmakers do something.
So inspiring, right?
It is. But also so sad that it took something so horrible to get that kind of attention, that kind of action. It feels like we're always reacting instead of, preventing. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the biggest takeaway for listeners? What should they be thinking about?
What's really hitting me is how this goes way beyond just gun control. It's about all these different pieces. Access to guns, the laws, the mental health system that's struggling, our whole culture around guns, the politics, the lobbying, it's all tangled up. And that makes finding solutions that much harder.
We've been talking about all these big picture things, the systems, the stats, the laws, but it's easy to forget sometimes that there are real people at the heart of this crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
Real stories, real families shattered by these events. So I think now we need to shift gears a bit, look at some specific cases, see what we can learn from them, on a human level.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's crucial to remember the human impact, the ripple effects of each of these tragedies, because they reveal patterns and they raise some big questions about, what's failing these people, what leads to this kind of violence.
So where do we even start? Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland, the Breaking Point podcast, they mentioned so many.
It is overwhelming, the number, yeah. But maybe we start with one of the most well-known cases, Columbine. That one really seemed to change the conversation nationwide. Back in 1999, 2 students, they got their hands on guns, multiple guns, and just opened fire on their classmates, their teachers, killed 13 people, injured over 20 others, and then they took their own lives.
Columbine. It's almost become a symbol, hasn't it, for school shootings. I remember it was everywhere, all over the news. It felt like a turning point, like this could happen anywhere.
It was a huge wake-up call for the country. It shattered this idea that schools were safe spaces, and it forced us to start talking about things we maybe didn't want to. Teen violence, guns, bullying, mental health, even the media's role in all this. And honestly, we're still dealing with the fallout from Columbine today. Its impact is still huge.
It's crazy. It's been over 2 decades, but it feels like yesterday sometimes. And the worst part is Columbine wasn't a one-off. It was just the beginning.
Right. And every case, it has its own unique elements, its own story. Take Sandy Hook, 2012, an elementary school, 21st graders, 6 educators killed. The sheer horror of that, the loss of such young, innocent lives, it shook everyone to the core.
I can't even imagine those families. It's just unthinkable.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that event, Sandy Hook, it brought the gun control debate back with a vengeance. People were demanding change. But even with all that support for stricter laws, nothing really happened. The politics, the gridlock we talked about before, it all just got in the way.
It's a pattern, isn't it? Tragedy strikes, people demand action, and then nothing, or not enough.
Yeah, it can feel that way. I know. It can be really frustrating. But it's important to remember there has been some progress, even if it's slow. After Parkland, the shooting in Florida in 2018, 17 lives lost at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. That one, it sparked a whole new wave of activism, especially among young people.
Right. The Breaking Point podcast, they talked about that. How those students, they channeled their grief, their anger into action. Marches, rallies, they even went to Washington to lobby lawmakers. They made sure their voices were heard.
They did, and Parkland, it showed the power of those young voices. They demanded a safer future. It was a powerful moment. Sad, obviously, incredibly sad, but powerful, a real testament to what people can do when they come together.
It's inspiring, yeah. But it just makes you think, does it always take a tragedy like that to get people to pay attention, to get things moving? It feels like we're always a step behind, reacting instead of preventing. So I guess moving forward, what can we do differently? What are some solutions that might actually make a difference? What did the Breaking Point podcast suggest?
Well, they spent a lot of time on gun control, obviously. Strengthening background checks, closing loopholes like the gun show one we talked about, even banning assault weapons altogether.
Right.
Those are all things that a lot of folks, especially those advocating for stricter gun laws, they believe that these measures would make it a lot harder for people who want to do harm to get their hands on guns. But as we know, gun control, it's a political minefield, and groups like the NRA, they're pushing back hard.
Right. They say it's all about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms.
Yeah.
And that we should be focusing on mental health, on school safety, not on taking guns away from people.
It's a complex debate, and we need to understand both sides, honestly. Find some common ground. Have real conversations. Look at the evidence. That's the only way we're going to make any real progress here.
So if we set aside gun control for a moment, what else is there? What other solutions are people talking about?
Mental health, that's a huge one. We've got to address this crisis head on. More funding for services, better access to care, and we've got to get rid of the stigma around mental illness. People need to feel comfortable asking for help, and that help needs to be available, affordable, and easy to get.
It's like we were saying before, right? Catch those warning signs early on. Get people the support they need before it gets to a point where they might hurt themselves or others.
Exactly. Early intervention, prevention, that's key. And it's not just mental health either. It's about tackling things like bullying, social isolation, making schools feel safer, more inclusive, places where kids feel connected, valued, like they belong.
Yeah, like building a sense of community where kids feel comfortable talking to someone if they're struggling or if they see something that's not right.
Absolutely. And teaching them how to handle conflict, how to resolve things peacefully, promoting empathy, respect, nonviolence. It's all part of the equation.
So it sounds like what we need is like a multi-pronged approach, right?
Yeah.
We've got to address the guns, the mental health system, the social and emotional needs of young people. It's a lot.
It is a lot, but it's not impossible. We can do this. It starts by understanding how all these things are connected and then taking a holistic approach. We can't just treat the symptoms. We've got to go deeper, address the root causes. It's not just about passing laws or creating programs. It's about a change in mindset, a cultural shift, where violence isn't seen as the answer.
It's a powerful thought, that changing hearts and minds, not just policies.
Exactly. And that's a long game. It's
Yeah.
going to take time, effort from everyone. Individuals, communities, institutions, we all have to be part of this.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways, some things you want listeners to really think about?
I think the biggest thing is remembering that school shootings, they're not isolated events. They're symptoms of bigger problems in our society, problems we have to face. And there's no easy fix, no magic bullet. It's going to take a lot of different approaches working together. Gun control, mental health, school safety, cultural change. It's all part of the puzzle. And lastly, don't lose hope. Change is possible. But it takes work, it takes commitment, it takes all of us refusing to accept the way things are.
Okay, so we've been digging into all these different aspects of gun violence, but there's one more piece we got to talk about, and it's a big one. Media and technology. How do they fit into all this? Feels like a whole other can of worms.
It is, yeah. The media, they shape how we see these events, how we talk about them. And now with social media, the internet, it's a whole new landscape, way more complex than even a few years ago.
The Breaking Point podcast, they brought up a really interesting point about media coverage, especially right after a shooting happens, how it can actually backfire, like have the opposite effect of what we want.
Yeah, one of the big worries is copycat attacks. The idea that giving these shooters a platform, any kind of attention, even if it's negative, it might actually encourage others to do the same thing, to try and get that same kind of notoriety.
So like by covering these tragedies, showing them on the news, online, are we actually making the problem worse?
It's tough, right? Because people need to know what's happening, but how do we do that responsibly? without potentially putting more people at risk.
It's a huge dilemma, no doubt. Some people are saying we need to be more careful about how we report on these things. Focus on the victims, the community, the impact. Don't give the shooter so much airtime. Don't sensationalize the violence.
Yeah, and the Breaking Point podcast also talked about how seeing these horrific things all the time, especially on social media, it can actually desensitize us. Like, we start to become numb to it, which is, I mean, that's a scary thought. It is a real concern. And it's not just the immediate coverage. The internet has become this breeding ground for extremism, for hate speech. It's so easy for people, especially young people, to find others who think like them, to get sucked into these online echo chambers. And those echo chambers, they can be dangerous. They can warp your view of the world.
It's like the internet creates these alternate realities where violence is seen as normal, even glorified. And if you're someone who's already struggling, maybe with mental health, feeling isolated, those online spaces, they can be incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. They provide this sense of belonging, of validation that people might not be getting in their real lives. And that can be a powerful pull, making them more vulnerable to manipulation, to radicalization.
So it's not just about what the news shows, right? It's the whole online environment. But what can we actually do about it? I mean, can we really control the flow of information in this digital age? It feels impossible.
It is a huge challenge, for sure. Social media companies, they're trying, right, with these content moderation policies. But it's like trying to balance free speech with protecting people from harmful content. It's a tough line to walk.
And it feels like a losing battle sometimes. Like you shut down one account, 10 more pop up. It's exhausting.
Yeah, it's like a game of whack-a-mole, you're right. And that's why we need to be coming at this from all angles. We need tech companies, lawmakers, educators, everyone working together to figure out how to deal with online extremism, how to teach people to be responsible online citizens.
So it's not about censorship. Exactly, right? It's about giving people the tools, the skills they need to navigate this digital world safely.
Right. We got to focus on media literacy, critical thinking, digital citizenship. Teach people how to separate fact from fiction, how to spot bias, how to make smart choices about what they see and share online.
Just like we need a whole new set of skills for this digital world we live in. And I guess beyond that, we got to keep working on the big picture stuff, right? The societal issues that feed into all this.
Absolutely. We can't ignore the root causes of violence. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. We need to create a society that's fairer, more just, where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Big job.
It is. But it's essential if we want real, lasting change.
Well, listeners, we made it. This has been a true deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. History, statistics, causes, potential solutions, the role of media and technology. It's a lot to take in, and I know it can feel overwhelming.
It's complex, for sure. But the main thing is to keep talking about it. Talk to your friends, your family, educate yourselves, get involved in your community, support organizations that are working on this issue. Even small actions can make a difference.
Change is possible, but it takes all of us. It takes commitment. It takes action.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some things to think about, some things to talk about, maybe even inspired you to get involved.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. Until next time, everyone.